All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the program on educational policy and governance here at Harvard University. We have an online audience, so we are beginning promptly on time. So thank you all for joining us today. And we are very fortunate today that we have with us Derrell Bradford, who is the president of 50 CAN, which is a national education reform organization that advocates for at the local level, for high quality schools for all kids. And Derrell, before he had this position, was the executive director at another organization with a similar mission, better education for kids. Derrell's going to speak today on Heroes. I love this title, Heroes, Movies, Assumptions, and Education. And I'm just fascinated to learn what this is all about. So thank you, Derrell, for joining us today here at Harvard.
No, thank you very much for having me. Honestly, I thought there'd be two crickets here and me and you. So I'm happy some other people showed up. I'm delighted to be here. And I don't have like super long remarks, so we'll do the remarks and would love to just like talk afterwards if you have any questions. Like let's chat about it. I'd like to thank Professor Peterson and Michael Four and the program on education policy and governance, and the fantastic staff at the Kennedy School at Harvard for having me here today. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to all of you, and if you should know that's the boilerplate. Thank you for any kind of speech like this. And I want to talk to you about two things that are sort of super interesting to me as a recovering English major, and those things are heroes and movies. And so I want to start with some information about heroes, right? And so you may or may not know, I don't know how many other English majors are in the house, that the hero has a journey that the hero is on, and that is called the heroic archetype, right? And you see this story and the features of this story in all kinds of stories about heroes across all kinds of different cultures. And these are sort of the specific things. So the hero is obviously special, has like an ability, is like smart or strong or fast or something like that, right? The hero has a fall from grace. So normally the hero makes a big mistake, has a moment of hubris, and that kicks off like the period in the wilderness, basically. The hero has a descent into darkness, which is either literal or figurative. It can be both. And the hero emerges from that descent into darkness with their view of the world changed and with their goals changed. So this is also known as the monomyth, right? So if you, I don't know if you guys are old, I think a couple people probably old enough to know who Joseph Campbell was and his work on sort of Carl Jung, but this was another way of visual representation of that same story. You see the call to adventure, you see all the places where a hero might have like a mentor, you see obviously the abyss, right, which is, you know, it is death and return, and then the return home with your goals and view of the world changed as well. So here are some well-known heroes, and this is the thing, I should have set this talk up and said that it has spoilers. Is the thing. The talk has spoilers. Up top is Odysseus, right? So if we think about the parts of the heroic archetype we just talked about, you know, Odysseus had an ability. He was clever, right? He was super smart. He was strong, but he was clever, right? And he has his moment of hubris where he's on a ship. He's just okey doked the Cyclops, and he's like, and the Cyclops like, I got a rock for you, you know. And he spends all this time wandering the Mediterranean, trying to get home to Penelope. And he has a descent into darkness, which in this case is sort of figurative because he goes to the underworld, right? And he emerges with his goal change and his view of the world change. Right here is another hero, because I like science fiction, which is like totally obvious at this point. And that's Ripley from Alien, right? So they kind of invert the darkness thing here because the whole movie takes place in the dark for the most part. And the moment where there's the revelation, right, the death reverse moment where she's in the abyss actually happens in a room that is incredibly well lit. It's the computer room where Ash, the android, sort of presents himself there. And then obviously in the end, her view of everything has changed because she knows this alien has changed, and she knows that the corporation she works for is basically like evil, you know. And then over here, here's the last one. This is Jon Snow. So I feel like we're out of the window where I have to not tell you what happened. Jon Snow dies in Game of Thrones. Okay, if anybody's watching this one live, there it is. Jon Snow dies in Game of Thrones, and so his descent into darkness is literal. Like he gets killed, he dies, and then he's resurrected, right? And his view of the world is changed, and his goal is changed. And you can see that how he leads the Night's Watch, and a bunch of other things, right? So these stories, like A Hero's Journey, also has a tremendous impact on how we tell the stories of heroes, right? So most stories have 3 pieces, you know, like most plays are in 3 acts, and each act to each part of the play serves a function in building the story. And this whole thing is always really about tension. It's about the introduction and the release of tension, and how much tension there is at any given time. And how much you release of it is incredibly important. So the 3 sort of steps to all of this are that there is a setup. You know, you spend time getting to know characters, getting to understand what they're about, what their motivations are. There is a confrontation where, like, you know, the shooting war happens, everything spills out into the street and lines are drawn. And then there is a resolution, a denouement, or any of these other things. Okay. So here are some movies that I think sort of express both the hero's journey and the 3-act thing, set up the confrontation and the resolution very well. So this one over here, this is Lawrence of Arabia, which is one of my favorite movies. David Lean, I can't remember the year. Can't remember, it's like 1969 or is it like 1972 or something. It's in that area. And actually, I'm gonna go back on myself. The hero and the star of that movie is the desert. If you see it, it is beautifully filmed. If you can see it in the movie theater, it is worth doing. But it's a wonderful film. And Lawrence of Arabia is an English, an officer, you know, in the English Imperium, and he winds up organizing sort of Bedouin tribes, ultimately to throw over himself in a lot of respects. And this movie is weird because it starts with the hero dying, and then you spend the rest of the time figuring out how the hero got there. And Lawrence has a very he has a descent in the darkness. It happens in a prison cell. It's sort of like very arresting and memorable, but it is a beautiful movie and it is totally worth seeing. Up here on the right is one of my favorite movies, that being The Matrix, because like as I've intimated before, like I like sci-fi, I like fantasy. And so Neo in the first movie, he goes through all of these steps too, right? He's obviously like a brilliant hacker, like that's his sort of ability. He's trying to figure out something that's going on in the world. He has 2 descents in the darkness, right? He has one when the world is revealed to him after he takes the red pill, right? And falls out of the what do they call it? Stops being a copper top, he falls out of the machine, you know, whatever, and now he's out in the real world. And then he has the second one where he literally dies, right? So, you know, Agent Smith kills him and he's dead. And then when he re-emerges in the Matrix, he has all these different powers and his view of the world is changed. Right? You can see all the code, it's all like very different. And he's like a super badass after that. And then down here in the corner, I didn't do this because it's November, because the new movie's about to come out, but I always got to give it up for Black Panther because Black Panther. So there's T'Challa and Eric Killmonger, who if you have watched TV for a long time, you will remember Michael B. Jordan as Wallace, the little boy in The Wire. And he was like so small and skinny that it's sort of like amazing to see him now. But these guys, their heroic journeys are sort of inverted. So they start sort of in the same place in the middle, and T'Challa is on this path to princehood, and Killmonger's dad is out in the world and sort of disgraced, right? That's where the movie starts. And then when they meet each other, they fight each other, right? And then Killmonger throws T'Challa off of a cliff, right? He has his descent into darkness, and then Killmonger ascends to the throne of Wakanda. And then they had the final fight together, and they both fall together into darkness. And then they sort of emerge with very different views of one another. It's a very good movie. There's one other movie I would just say this in the Marvel Cinematic Universe that I also like very much that I didn't put up here, and that is Captain America: The Winter Soldier, which is really good. If you have, it's got a great poster. If you haven't seen it, you should see it. And Captain America has these 3 phases that he goes through. And in the first one, he's sort of like a cut up for patriotism. And then the second one, he's asking like very interesting questions about government and the structure of America and the incentives around freedom. And then the third one, he's sort of like a champion for like American liberty, or like liberty as a construct, in a way that you might not have anticipated. It also has amazing fight scenes. Okay, so one of the movies that brings all of this stuff together for me is Star Wars. And Star Wars obviously has 3 acts. It's got, well, now it's got 9 acts, but we're only going to talk about the first 3 because the other 6 are largely forgettable. Wait, did I hear some feelings were hurt there? Is that what happens? Quick question: of the first 3 movies, which is the best one? Anyone polling? Everybody?
Number 3.
No, number 3 being Jedi.
Revenge of the Jedi.
You like Jedi? Okay, wow. All right, I'm sorry, that's the wrong answer. I would go with Empire, which is also the one that Lucas did not direct, and it's also the one where the rebellion is at its weakest, right? So it's sort of, but I actually did like Jedi for reasons that will become evident momentarily. So Luke is our hero, right? And we see Luke in all 3 acts, in all 3 sort of like iterations of himself, right? So he's a hero who's on this journey, and he's finding out about the world and himself and about the Force. And sort of the important thing about the Force is that the Force is like an unknown. And so in some respects, we are always exploring his relationship with the unknown, which is important because in a policy sense, the unknown is risk, right? And so a lot of the time we're exploring how we feel about risk when we talk about what kinds of policies we care about or which ones we want to support. So up here in the first movie, here he is, right? And he's trying to figure out what's going on and everything. There he is in the second movie, right after Vader cut his hand off. So that's at the height of the confrontation. And here he is in the third movie in all of his Jedi consular badassery with the green lightsaber and everything. And the important thing about Luke's journey is that he asks different questions at each part of the journey because he is a different person at each part of the journey. So in the first movie, I would argue that the question he is asking is, who is my father? And then in the second movie, because he thought his father was dead, right? In the second movie, when he finds out that Vader is his father, his question is, how can you be my father? And then in the third movie, when he sort of decided he wants to go all in and bring him back, his question is, how can I save my father? Right? The Jedi is really this, in this way, a story of redemption between he and himself, really, and he and Vader, and also very, very good movies. Now, the other thing too is that the story of heroes are sort of stories of assumptions, right? So we talked about how a hero is a different person depending on where they are in the story. We talked about the questions that a hero asks based on where they are in their narrative, and those questions are also sort of support the assumptions the hero has about the world at any given time. So let's think about Luke again here. Like I said, in the first movie, he's asking, who is my father? Because his assumption was that Vader killed his father. And in the second movie, he's asking, how can you be my father? Because he assumed Vader was irredeemable and unsavable. And in Jedi, he's asking, how can I save my father? Because he'd come to believe that there was actually a way back for him, despite how long he'd been a creature of the dark side and the strength of the Emperor. And he's ready to sacrifice himself to prove that point, and Anakin instead sacrifices himself to prove the same thing. That was one side. So now, folks, maybe somebody watching this online knows I like movies. I guess lots of people should know I like movies now. I'm hoping all of you know that I like movies, but this talk really isn't about movies. It's about us. And we all have, all had some assumptions as well over the last 2 decades that I've been involved in education policy and school choice policy. And I'd like to talk about those a little bit. And just to put some context out there, I want to talk where I think we are in 3-act structure. And I would just say, I think we're at the end of the second movie, the confrontation. Okay. So I'm not trying to say education policy advocates are heroes. I am trying to say that if you're on a journey about education policy, which is actually a journey about society, it has acts, it has arcs, right? It has moments when you know more than you knew, and things that you thought were true are no longer true, and it has descents into darkness, right? And it has moments where people who are trying to improve the world emerge, change from those descents with their goals and take on the world change. And so I would like to share a couple of those things with you that that I've gone through, and then there's a way that I will end this. I wouldn't normally end it, but I hope you'll stick with it. Okay, so this is the first one. And I'm going to cold call on people to do this. Ira, why don't you read the charter assumption, please?
The charter assumption: we can make public schools that districts do not run. They will be laboratories for innovation, and their practices will be widely disseminated. They will provide choice for families that don't normally have it. They will close achievement gaps for low-income kids of color. And as a result, the politics will sort themselves out for this revolutionary educational option.
Yeah, that was an assumption I had, and I think this one is proven to be untrue. And over here on the right, you'll see a couple of headlines. Let's do some other random stuff. Why don't you read the first, please?
New Biden administration rules for charter schools spurred by practicing backlash. I'm not sure if you understand my accent.
It's okay. I understand it. Let's do it. The people out there can see it. So,
all right. Critics of the proposal say the rules are overly restrictive and would stymie the growth of charter schools, whose 3.6 million students are largely Black and Hispanic.
thank you very much. Jedi fan, why don't you read the second one, please?
Luke Jackson, an education department spokesperson, declined to make anyone from the department available for an on-the-record interview. Jackson recommended that Chartbeat speak to supporters of the proposal, including Carol Bruni's, executive director for the Network for Public Education, a group that opposes charter schools.
Thank you very much. And then the last one, I'd like to bring it home for my burg of New Jersey. Why don't you read the last one and the briefest one?
Sure.
Yeah.
Phil Murphy stifles New Jersey's charter schools. In his first term, the Democratic governor denied nearly 2/3 of requested expansions.
Yeah, and so this article was published at a time right when it was starting to sort of crystallize for policymakers that the pandemic's effect on kids was substantial and real. And the charter school network at issue here is called Uncommon Schools in Newark, which has like one of the best high schools in New Jersey of any type. I gave the commencement speech here before the pandemic. The valedictorian was going to Yale, the salutatorian was going to Princeton, 2 young Black women from Newark. And you'd think that a school like that, which basically specializes in closing achievement gaps, would be particularly well positioned to help with ameliorating the effects of the pandemic. And this was about 300 seats, and the governor said no. So my first assumption is up for debate. Okay, here's the second one. This one's sort of pretty funny for the policy heads in the House. Professor Peterson, why don't you read the evaluation assumption over here? And this is teacher evaluation, by the way.
Teachers that improve student outcomes on standardized tests have a greater impact on long-term student success than those who don't. Centralized systems of performance management with standardized tests as a key feature will help us manage and improve the teaching force overall. The American teaching profession will accept this because it's good for students. No one will actively try to sabotage it.
So I'd like to thank, is Raj Chetty still here? I would like
Yes,
to
he
thank
is.
Raj Chetty for setting this assumption up. I will say that when this whole first thing was described for me, I was kind of like, I get it, but I kind of don't know. So maybe that was like a half. I was all in on the prior assumption. This one I was like a little half baked on. Hugh, sweatshirt. Why don't you read this one for us, please?
Study, teacher evaluation reforms fail to improve student outcomes. Broadest assessment of reform efforts finds near zero impact.
So I have a bunch of friends who would say I'm trying to throw shade on this, and I'm not really trying to. But from a political standpoint, if you're trying to pass a law or like improve a policy environment, you have limited ability to do so. And that limited ability is called political capital. So you have to be like careful when you spend it. You need to have like windows when you spend it. And we spend it all on this. Like, and I didn't want to spend it all on it, but the powers that be, the greater education policy consensus, thought this was incredibly important, and we could have gone in on something else. And so this is very disappointing to see it land here. There are some places that really stuck with this, like DC is the, I know Michelle series, the DC Impact is like an outlier in terms of using a performance management framework like this based on student objective measures to manage the teaching force. But for all the places we tried it, there are relatively few places where it's stuck. Okay. Here's the last assumption, which I think is pretty fun. Antonio, why don't you do this one?
The Republican assumptions. Conservatives and Republicans love school choice. Republicans hate teacher unions.
Thank you very much. That was very short. And you in the back, why don't you read this one over at the other side of this, please? You please,
Okay.
yes.
Why school choice is roiling the GOP. The attack was pegged to McCall's opposition to a controversial bill that would allow any student to use state funds to attend private schools or to be homeschooled. The legislation is backed by GOP Governor Kevin Stitt. Stitt, but McCall has argued that it would do little for rural communities like the ones he serves because there aren't, bubbles are a little bit distance. There aren't many or any other school options.
Thank you very much. The bubbles did not interfere. So, so this is in Oklahoma right now, and this was I think a USA Today article from earlier in the spring, and it's interesting because this assumption is a failure to understand Republicans, because like even in a supermajority, Republicans are on a continuum. So you can be in New York or New Jersey, where I am, and Democrats are in supermajorities, and they are on a continuum, right? There are intra-party fights and interests that dictate the kind of policies they support. So here, like they passed open enrollment a couple of years ago, so you can, in theory, go to any public school that you want to if you can get there. And transportation policy is obviously like an important piece of this. But the private school choice thing fails to note that there's sort of like three kinds of Republican interests, I would say, on school reform. There is what I'll call like a Chamber of Commerce Republican. So this is a person who like cares about results, believes in market pressure and choice and competition and all these other things, and ultimately cares about the cost, right? And so those folks have been allies of folks like me for like a really long time. Then there is a second group of people who are like suburban Republicans who know that the fact that your school choice is bundled with your housing choice is deeply important to the people who elect them. And so if you align, like those people are acting with completely rational incentives, even if they're reprehensible, because the last thing you want to do is go to get elected and have everybody come out and say, you blew up 10% of my housing value, right? This is what's going on right now. It's not housing value per se, but like inflation in this instance is maybe an analog. People are like, I have 10% less money. Somebody's going to pay, right? So that's another one. And then the third group are rural Republicans who, it's interesting, like rural schools and sort of traditionally and urban schools that have traditionally been at the center of debates about policy change actually share lots of similarities. But they need sort of slightly different policy prescriptions. So in New York City, you might be like, we need to make it so that kids can go to Catholic schools as well. In a rural district, it might be like, well, we need course choice, because the 3 small towns can't afford to hire 3 physics teachers on their own, right? So we need a way for the kid to be able to buy into the 1 physics teacher that we can all afford, or something like that. So this again, and there's another one about this you could say about Democrats and neoliberalism and capitalism, like that, you know, there's a strain of that which has been incredibly important, which I think has been fighting itself out for the kind of longest time. So that is the Republican assumption. Go back to the last slide. No, there's the last slide. There's supposed to be one slide there. Oh, there it is. That's it. That's the one. No, how do we do that? Is the
Sorry.
yeah, that's the one. Boom. Okay. So this is not the way I would normally end this talk, but I think it's super important to end this talk this way, and then we can kind of go to questions. And this is the learning. This is the pandemic assumption, right? The learning loss assumption. And we don't have to read it out loud, but I'm just going to kind of like voice over it because I think it's super important. I know everybody here probably knows that the National Assessment of Educational Progress results were released a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago. Disastrous and calamitous are just 2 of the adjectives that have been used to describe the results. And while, you know, to talk about movies, and while time travel may be fictitious, we have managed to turn the clock back on student achievement as much as 30 years in some places. And I just want you all to know that this is not just a problem of low-income kids, Black or brown kids. Suicide and mental health issues are up as well across like all kinds of kids. The kids are not all right. Disastrous, calamitous. If you must frequent that cesspool of human misery called Twitter, as I often must, you'll find 3 sets of arguments about these results. One, which is actually mine, is that they are a human tragedy of the highest order. One from which students will not recover unless something is done immediately. Think a Marshall Plan for academic recovery and acceleration. And it's not like the money isn't there. $190 billion in COVID relief funds have been committed for just this purpose, yet no one seems to know about it. Even as $120 billion of it remains unspent in school district bank accounts across the country. The other 2 arguments are actually quite sinister. One is that nothing has been lost. Kids didn't go to school. How could they lose anything? Poorly delivered virtual and packets are still teaching. Why should we compare children to some arbitrary number, even when everyone is behind? We should eliminate state tests and other assessments that give us this information. Why suffer the stigma? The other is that mistakes were made. No one is to blame. We should just move on to solutions. This is a crucial moment for education policy broadly in this country and public education specifically. In the right here and the right now, and in my mind, and it comes down to a misunderstanding of what has happened to both our schools and our children. It is my fear that we have taught public education that it can deny its compulsory service to children and families when one of its professional constituencies wants something: money, an election victory, to stop policy change. The list continues to grow. It is also my fear that the scale of this will be underestimated. This is not an earthquake that happens on land, where the shaking and the destruction happen quickly and in plain view. It is instead that same earthquake, but deep underwater, where the real danger is the low and fast-moving wave whose true power is only revealed when it crests on the shore of our daily lives. So you're all here at Cambridge, Harvard. If anyone has the power to do something meaningful about this, it is someone in this room. And I hope that if the opportunity presents itself for you to do so, you will. Thank you.
Oh, so that was an incredibly powerful and provocative presentation, Derrell. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. I'm sure I have lots of questions. I mean, they're just so, they're right over here, right? Waiting to jump out of the bag. But somebody else has questions as well. So let me turn it to whoever wants to go first. All right, if you're
It was
also.
like, don't all go at once.
If you're also shy, oh, I was never shy, okay.
Well, just is the pandemic assumption, just to clarify, and it may be my fault for not understanding. Do you think that's a false assumption as well, or that's the assumption that the hero, the new true assumption that the hero reaches at the end of his heroic journey?
All right, you're fine. You're an A student there. You get a gold star for that one. No, I think that so again, this is something I've added to the end of it because it's super important even without the narrative. So if we're all on this journey, right, where we emerge with sort of how we look at the world, how we think about the world, what we know about our institutions, whatever is important, then like COVID was like a descent into darkness, right? And so now we're all re-examining our relationships with each other and with the institutions around us, right? And that includes media, that includes academia, and it certainly includes American K-12 schooling. I'm concerned that there is like a very deliberate effort to spin the reality we've all kind of emerged into. One that will make it significantly harder for us to address the challenges of kids who live through this, right? And frankly, adults who live through it too, right? I mean, like it's not the kids aren't all right, but based on like crime figures and a whole bunch of other stuff, to me it seems pretty evident that the adults aren't all right as well. And so I just want to make sure that people are aware of the fact that there is a competing vision for the hero right now. Will we actually intervene on this in a way that's commensurate with what has happened, instead of sort of just turning the page and letting the gravity of 2019 recapture everything, which I think is a desired outcome for a lot of folks. Yes.
I'm wondering what assumptions are being made about students with disabilities and how does that incorporate into this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one of the like IDEA law is not like a specific area of expertise for me, but I am well aware of the fact that if there was any group of students who had incredibly strong protections that were sort of violated en masse during the pandemic, it was students with special needs, right? And so on the one hand, again, this like question about our relationship with our institutions. So I can understand why that happened in March of 2020. And I always put my cards on the table with this, and Professor Peterson knows this. In March 2020, I remember writing this thing where I was like, I'm not a virtual learning advocate, but I was like, you need to get good at virtual. I know I was in my apartment and lucky enough to be able to be there. Like I'd just taken a trip to Georgia that Friday, and then New York City public schools shut down, whatever. So I was like a card carrying closer for what that's worth. But by August, it was very clear to me that we knew more and that politics were at play, right? This was very much about incentives around the election and Trump and Biden and like what that meant and what the role of school closures, like the effect that had on the political process, because it did, right? And so by that time, I'm like, why hadn't we started to recenter on students who had the strongest federal and local protections under IDEA or any other thing? And so I would just say that one, right, like this is one of these important questions that needs to get answered. And this is why I'm really very interested in, I don't want to call it blame, because there's like a lot of discussion about this right now. Although I do think millions of American families deserve an apology from somebody. I don't know who it is, but somebody should be like, I feel you, this is terrible, I'm with you. But we allowed this to happen, right? We allowed what in the spring of 2020 was like, felt pretty incontrovertible set of decisions that we knew were going to hurt people, like that. And the way school years ended, particularly in San Francisco, they just gave everybody an A, which was like particularly distressing to me, especially from an equity standpoint. I was just like, everybody's going to know the black kid's A isn't really an A, and everybody's going to think the white kid's A is an A. So like you've actually done enormous harm here, right? Like there were all kinds of things happening like that at the end of the year. But the fact that we didn't change it, as soon as we could is particularly distressing. So I didn't, I know I haven't answered your question specifically, I do think that the money is there, and this is the important thing, like the resources are there to support kids who need it the most more. And I'm waiting to see what school districts, governors, and other folks are going to do about it.
So I'm going to give you a tough question,
I thought that was hard.
Derrell. My question is, the NAEP results that just came out that showed this distressing decline in student performance as compared to earlier years, did not exempt the charter schools.
Yeah.
They, the private schools, the story looks a little more favorable, Catholic schools in particular. But the charter schools look like they suffered as much as the kids in the charter schools as much as in the traditional district-run schools. So can you give me an accounting of why that is the case?
Yeah, so I have a theory, and it's like, so for all the folks in the room and online, you know, if you search the internet, you will find out I'm a notorious charter school booster. So I support charter schools, right? But I think on the one hand, you found out that if you pay schools to be closed, they will close. And Catholic schools and private schools did not get paid to be closed, and so they opened, right? So you can't sort of miss the incentives that traditional district schools, charter schools, and private schools live in. So that's the first one. The second one I would say is that, in particular, where New York is concerned, I do think it's a little more complicated where charter schools are concerned because you have co-location. So if folks don't know, it's like sometimes a charter school is in a building with a traditional district school. They don't own the building. That, like, some places they might have to pay rent to be in that building, that kind of thing. And that does confound policies around being open in a school that is closed over the last couple of years. So that is another thing to consider. The third thing I would just say is that particularly when you look at DC, because like the DC results are like, you know, low-income kids in charter schools are doing incredibly well. And basically, after the last 2 years, are at the exact same level as kids who were in the districts. And to me, that means that whatever the magic is in DC charters, it happens in person, right? They haven't figured out how to deliver it online in a way that is replicable or scalable. And so, so that's sort of like an important lesson to them. You know, and then the last thing, and this is one that's very frustrating, it's just that I think we learned that the incentives for charter schools are much more closely aligned with districts than anybody really wanted to think. And that is disturbing, given that the idea is that you're supposed to not be sort of like a remora on the shark of district incentives. You're supposed to chart your own way, you know, like go be like a koi or something like that. And so that's troubling. And I don't think there's been like a real reckoning on that. Like in Memphis, the charter schools were closed for a very long time because it was, you know, you didn't upset the apple cart in terms of district authorizing or any other stuff. And it was financially beneficial to do so. There are all kinds of things you didn't have to pay for because your facility wasn't open. And certainly the district there operated under those same incentives.
You mentioned that there was like a huge surplus of like COVID-19 relief funds that kind of remains underutilized. What are some of the barriers that inhibit schools from like knowing about it or knowing what to do with it? And how can we put that towards like efforts like teacher retention and like things?
It's a great question. So I've had all kinds of feels about this, and I'm at this place now where I'm like, just give families the money. Because school districts seem more incentivized to hoard it than to use it, right? And the sort of problem is a problem of now that will last for like numerous years. And so the longer we wait to sort of like spend it and get on the problem, the longer it's going to take to fix it. And I don't think that, you know, like committing it in a budget line item counts that. Some people are like, well, on this spreadsheet, it says I'm going to spend this next year. It's like the money's in the bank like right now, like, you know, spend it. It's actually going to be worth less next year, given how things are. So you should commit to it now. So the first thing, and this is sort of important. So there are multiple tranches of COVID relief aid that go to schools. And the first one came out in sort of like two buckets. One of which went to sort of state departments of education, because not every state department of education is under the control of the governor, right? The other went to governors. It was called the GEAR was the sort of the acronym or the name for it. And lots of creative stuff happened with the GEAR money because it was sort of a straight line to do it. So you can look at a place like Tennessee, where the governor does appoint the state chief, and they're like incredibly aligned on policy. And so they did summer camp for like 20,000 kids and tutoring for a whole bunch of families, right? And so the data seems to show that there is that the impact there has been less than it would have been had they not. Arizona, the governor did like summer camp for something like some outrageous number of kids over the summer, and Arizona is one of the places where it looks like they were hit a lot less. So governors actually have tremendous power to do this, and some of the money is with state departments of education, and so the fact that that money is spent is really like it's sort of a different question. The other tranches of money went straight to districts, and part of the reason why it went straight to districts is because like union interests in particular were like, well, governors are doing things with this money that we don't want them to do, right? Like, we'd rather figure out what we want to do with money ourselves. And so that means that basically the money's in limbo at this point. And the only thing that will, to your point, get to teacher prep or like free tutoring for every kid or like summer enrichment or like every museum is open for the next year, right? Or every kid can play any sport that they want for the next year or something like that, that it's like, we're going to make kids whole, we're going to do all this stuff, is only going to happen through the political process at this point. So you either have to nail down a superintendent and get them on board, you have to get a school board on board, or you have to raise so much hell that a local elected official is like, I don't understand why all this money is in my backyard, and all these people are calling me about why it's not spent, like you have to answer to it. So the political process is the thing that, you know, we're trying to be better at. It is harder. Parents and the folks who have the money are much more determined most of the time about it. So, yeah.
You just listed a lot of cool ways that money can be spent. I'm wondering if there's anything else that schools or districts are doing that you're excited about in reaction.
Yeah, so I'll just point you to a website called Edu Recovery Hub that is basically like listing all the cool stuff people would do, you know, or all the stuff that you would want listed above the fold in the New York Times that people are doing with the money. The other sort of like companion site for this is something that the Edunomics Lab did, which is called the Learning Loss Calculator, and it basically takes the gap between where your kids should be and where they are. And I think Tom Kane helped out on this actually. Looks at your COVID relief money and tells you how much money you have available per kid to do something. And that is it's like a simple tool, but it's powerful. Yes.
I'm wondering if you have taken any comparative lens to see what's something that's challenging for the U.S. system in particular, or if there's anything that's other interesting been done that you think can be replicated.
Yeah, so this whole thing has been an interesting exercise in thinking about how other nations prioritize education versus how the United States does. Certainly like Sweden, you know, like they didn't do the brain fog thing. You know, they were like basically the whole time, you know, and there are lots of European countries that open like, you know, like way ahead of us. They prioritized schools over bars, you know, and I don't know if you know this, but there is an author named Ursula K. Le Guin. She wrote this book called A Wizard of Earthsea, which is a very good book. She also wrote this short story called The Ones Who Leave Omelas, and it is about a utopia. And the cost of this utopia is that they basically consign one child to misery, right? So, and when I read it, I was like, this is a metaphor, right? Every flourishing society makes trade-offs, right, for its flourishing. And the question is like, how much can the sort of the morality of your society deal with? And I used to always think about it that way until the last 2 years, because that is what we did, right? Like as a nation, like we literally and figuratively did this thing to kids as a trade-off for our prosperity. And I think everybody should feel pretty awful about it. And that says something about us, right? Like as a people, what we value as a nation, where kids are in it. And it also says something about the political incentives of our education apparatus, whose health, welfare, and comfort they prioritize. And I would argue that kids in the top 3, but they're not number 1.
So of course, I agree with you. I will admit to, like you saying in the summer of 2020, if we don't open up schools this fall, it's going to be a disaster. We know that from every time schools have closed in the past, whether it's been due to strikes or due to weather or due to a war, when kids don't go to school, the impact on the next generation is durable, long-lasting, and you're not going to be able to avoid it. So there was plenty of evidence early on that we were pursuing a policy that was totally disastrous. And you're absolutely right. Somebody needs to be held accountable for this disastrous behavior. In our country, we decentralize the control of education so much, so it's very, very difficult to get your hands on it. Is it the school boards, or is it the State Department, or is it the governor? And in different states, different actors were responsible. So it's not like there's any one single answer to it. But I suppose I should say that in the end, we can blame all we want, but the question is, where do we go forward? And in my view, the option of choice is tutoring. We know more about kids learning in a one-to-one setting than anything else. And we know that one-to-one setting is really effective. And you can get massive increases in capacity quickly if you have one-to-one tutoring in person. So why isn't the investment concentrated in this area, and how could it be?
Yeah, so great question. We're big supporters of tutoring as, like, you know, an intervention of high leverage, right? And I would just say a couple of things. So at 50CAN, we're interested in helping the education system of the future emerge by fighting for it here in the present. And so when we think about doing any of these things, right, like tutoring, there is the short-term benefit of it, which is that we have kids that we need to accelerate and undo the harm of the last 2.5 years the best we can. And then there's also, like, what does this mean for how people interact with education in the future, right? And is this interaction with a tutor now going to help us build a robust framework where, like, individualization is prioritized and out-of-school learning is prioritized, and lots more people are able to come and help us solve the problems of education as they, present themselves over future years. So I just want to kind of put that on there. I would just say that one of the challenges for tutoring right now is that the take on it is so highly regulated against traditionally, what I will just say are like engineered teacher shortages that are built into how young teachers are hired, paid, and deployed in traditional K-12 district schools, that you have the worst, like, unmatch of incentives possible to say, I'm going to put a ton of teachers on the problem, right? And so on the one hand, you know, I read a lot of stuff about teacher shortages, and maybe some people say there aren't any, some people say there are ones. But the problems of taking young, new teachers who have been, like, not particularly well prepared, not paying them well, and giving them the toughest assignments because they don't have seniority, has always been a vehicle for shortages in the first 5 years, right? Like, people, and there's not an acknowledgement of the fact that for women in particular, there are other career options, right? The labor market is, like, increasingly more competitive. So if you get a crappy teacher job where you're not supported very well, you can go work for Google, right? You could go do that, you know? And that discreetly is a set of things that is making it incredibly difficult to put tutoring, to make tutoring like the go-to solution for a lot of people. So you can look at, like, Tennessee again, you know, like Success Academy during the pandemic had a thing where, like, the high school kids were tutoring people, you know? Like, I think we have to have a solution that basically allows almost everybody who wants to be a part of the tutoring solution to be a part of it, right? And that requires some regulatory changes or who can teach. It could be easier to do that if you just gave parents the money, right? If you were like, go hire a tutor, you know, like that. I think there are other levers that we can pull to make that happen. But for as much tutoring as going on in the country right now, there should be a ton more of it.
Question. There's one question online.
Oh, can you read it?
Sure. This is from Moira Ryan. I watched my son, who's a student with disabilities, completely flounder. School was doing virtually nothing for him. He was going to graduate last year, but did not by one class. I observed him not learn any chemistry and lack the basics. How do we go back if those skill sets were completely ignored? And he also missed years of services, which set back his ability to live independently. How do we tie life outcomes of students to education, make sure they're getting what they need?
So that's really powerful, and thank you for sharing it with us. And it certainly goes a little bit back to the discussion we had earlier about what happened with special needs students and the pandemic. I would just say three things. One, and this is why I keep saying like we need to have a reckoning, kind of, is that this can't happen again, right? There are smaller ways, and you mentioned them, strikes, etc., that schooling is denied to kids, and we just have to have like a conversation as a country about the fact that this is happening. That's the first thing. The second thing I would just say is that there's sort of two groups of kids. Like, there's no discussion about the pandemic and high school kids, right? It's normally about young kids, middle school kids, because it's sort of easiest to focus on them. I remember there was a day in LA when 50,000 kids didn't show up for school. I mean, it's unbelievable, like these sort of anecdotes, but they do add up to something. So there's two kids. There is a kid that was sort of on track to let's say college. And that kid is, in some cases, there's an article this week about it, in some cases getting to college and just wildly behind, right? So that is one symptom that needs to be addressed. There is another kid that might have been on track for college, but essentially dropped out because the pandemic created economic stresses in their home or whatever, and they just didn't matriculate back in. And that kid is like lost right now. So there needs to be a specific intervention for that kid that is like, how do we get you back into school and on the course of what you need to do to be, or how do we get you to career, right? In a way that's meaningful. And then like the third thing I would just say, which is the third answer that is for half of the second answer, is that a lot of kids are going, a lot of, sort of middle school kids, high school kids right now are going to focus on career specifically because of the last two and a half years. And we need to be better as a society at helping them do that in a way that isn't like you go to shop class because you're not a smart kid. You go to, you're here because this is a viable path for you, one that you are interested in, and we want to build the education system that works for you. Thank you for your question.
So I have a final question, which has to do with one of the arguments that you articulated when you talked about the excuses that were being made for those who made those policy decisions, and those who say, well, really, it's not so bad. There's nothing we could have done about it anyhow. And they would say probably, look at the pandemic was a pandemic. It had disastrous effects on lots of things out there. There's really not much that could have been done about this. This learning loss is across the board. All students were affected by it, but that's because the pandemic was across the board. You're picking on the schools when really it was a much broader set of factors in all aspects of life that were responsible for the learning loss. So why can't we just blame it on to that?
Yeah, because if all schools had responded uniformly, you could make that argument, but all schools did not, right? So there are parents who there's a whole microschooling and potting movement that is catalyzed by the fact that schools are not open. There were states that prioritized tutoring, right? There were states that prioritized being open. There were Catholic school systems like Chicago and Philadelphia that were open while their district systems were closed at the same time, right? And there were public schools in many wealthier districts that were wildly less likely to have remote, and public schools in urban districts filled with poor kids that were wildly more likely to have remote. So to me, the scattershot nature of how schools dealt with the problem actually confounds that that argument. If everyone had stayed closed, which was a policy decision that some people were trying to enforce. In Maryland, there were counties that tried to close their private schools. In California, at the start of the pandemic, Gavin Newsom tried to do this as well, almost as a way to eliminate the comparison, right? Like you wouldn't be able to prove that another set of schools could do it. If that had all happened, we'd be having like very different conversation, but it didn't, so we had to have this one.
So you're saying the schools that stayed open, the kids learned?
The Catholic school data, excuse me, seems to prove that. And in a universe of losses, the wealthy schools that were open longer and that did in person longer aren't feeling what New York City feels, which is, disastrous, like absolutely disastrous. Like 800,000 kids, last bunch of schools to open. By some reports, 1 in 11 kids have left the city school system. Like this is like a very big deal.
All right, so thank you very much,
Thank you
Derrell,
for having
for
me.
a fantastic presentation. You are our hero today.